Hey, good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for folks to keep being added on, and then we'll get started. So just hold tight. All right, it looks like it's slowed up on those folks joining the meeting. Again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third public work group to discuss clean mobility investment projects and for the fiscal year 2022-23 update to the three-year plan for clean transportation equity investments. I'm Sam Greger. I'm one of the managers overseeing a great team of folks who are working hard to ensure these investments get to our communities for clean mobility projects. And I wanted to thank everyone for taking your time today to participate and to help provide us with feedback. This is one in a series of work groups for the funding plan for clean transportation incentives that covers light duty, equity, and heavy duty investments to help meet the state's goals of clean air and getting zero emission transportation options to low income and disadvantaged communities. The suite of light duty and equity incentives includes the Clean Cars for All and the Clean Vehicle Assistance Programs, whose goals are to help low income households purchase zero emission vehicles. In addition, and this is what today's work group covers, is the other main component of equity, which includes clean mobility projects, such as zero emission car sharing, bike sharing, micromobility, and other community-based focused incentives to help increase access to clean transportation and reduce vehicle miles traveled. Just some logistical things to go through. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We anticipate the recording will be made available on our low carbon transportation investments meetings and workshops page in about 2 to 4 weeks. The slide deck is also available on that same webpage, and we've included in the chat a link to these slides if you haven't already looked at them. We'll be using the Zoom webinar raised hand and question and answer box to facilitate comments and questions. Directions are provided in the presentation for each of these comment periods. Also, we do have a lot of slides to cover. It's a lot of information as we're wrapping up this 3-series work group. So we're going to ask that we limit questions and comments to 2 to 3 minutes per person so that everyone who would like to talk has the opportunity. Also, if there are any Zoom disruptions for any reason, including malicious intent, we will immediately end the meeting and send out a notice to reschedule. Also, we cannot allow anonymous participants for security reasons, so please make sure that your name is clear on the Zoom platform. And with that, I thank you again, and I will pass it on to Ashley Georgia, one of the lead staff, who will walk you through the agenda and group discussion.
Thank you, Sam, and to everyone for attending today. So as Sam mentioned, this is the third in a series of 3 work group meetings we have had to discuss the mobility long-term plan. First, we will provide a reminder of our funding plan for clean transportation incentives timeline and process, which is now a consistent part of our work group and workshop process, just to make sure that everyone is informed. We will then move to a discussion on the work group purpose and focus, so we all have a grounding of the key desired outcomes and areas where CARB is seeking input. Then we will jump into an overview of the long-term plan, discuss past feedback we have received, so we can make sure that we are all on the same page and can be transparent about what has been shared. We will discuss the evaluation of investment progress and benefits, provide mobility program updates, including for our regional clean mobility projects, also known as legacy projects, Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, Clean Mobility in Schools, and Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. Finally, we will cover the revised long-term plan proposal based on the May 2022 revision to the governor's proposed budget. followed by comments and questions and next steps. It's important to note that there are multiple points in today's agenda for comments and questions, which in some places will be framed around discussion questions, which we hope will facilitate feedback on specific areas of plan development. In addition to Sam Greger and myself, we are joined by Ava Yagubi-Rad, who will discuss our regional clean mobility pilots and the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program, proposed improvements, timeline for the next application window, outreach and technical assistance. Cesar Hernandez from CalSTART, who is part of the CMO administrative team, who will support Ava in the CMO program updates discussion and provide background and an overview as well of key lessons learned from application window number 1. Bree Swenson, who will be covering program updates for clean mobility in schools and the sustainable transportation equity projects and the revised long-term plan proposal. Violet Martin, who will discuss planning and capacity building grants, and Sean Ransom, who will be helping us today with Zoom raised hands and discussing how we are identifying clean mobility investment gaps and our plans moving forward as part of the long-term plan proposal and the funding plan process. So next, I will provide a brief overview of our funding plan for clean transportation incentives timeline and more information for how to participate in this process. This will be part of public meetings and the support for the funding plan development going forward as a reminder. We want to make sure our process is clear and that critical decision points and opportunities for involvement are also clear. So CARB's funding plan development follows a similar process each year and is connected to key points with the development of the state's budget, where funding to support clean transportation incentives is appropriated by the legislature. To give you a quick overview of this process as demonstrated here, each year the governor proposes a budget and it's released in January. The administration releases what's known as a May revise. This year, the May revised budget came out on May 13th. The legislature will finalize the budget bill and appropriate funding over the next couple of months. As the state budget is being developed and approved by the legislature, CARB develops a plan on how we would expend the dollars appropriated for clean transportation incentives, known as the funding plan. We hold a number of public meetings to request feedback and inform policy proposals before ultimately taking the funding plan to our board for consideration. This year, we expect the funding plan to go to our board in November. Project-specific implementation will begin in December, and each individual project will proceed following the general steps that we have here. There are a number of opportunities to participate in the funding plan process. We hold kickoff workshops. This year, that occurred on March 15th. Since then, CARB has been holding project-specific work group meetings. There's one more funding plan workshop scheduled for July 21st, and we're also happy to meet with folks outside of the formal work group and workshop process anytime. Following the release of the proposed funding plan, the public comment period will be open from October 7th through November 7th. CARB's board is then scheduled to hear the draft funding plan proposal along with public testimony and approve it during the board meeting on November 17th through 18th. Now I will discuss the specific purpose and areas of focus for today's work group discussion. The purpose of discussion today is to provide an overview of the long-term plan development. To do so, we will recap previous public work group meetings we've held on clean mobility investments and also highlight stakeholder feedback and discussion that has led to planning out these investments over time. We will also provide some new information that highlights investment gaps and benefits, which is central to the methodology for developing a long-term plan for mobility investments. We will share methodologies for measuring and tracking benefits to communities from these investments, including socioeconomic and other quality of life benefits as well. Finally, we will discuss the May revision to the governor's proposed budget and provide an updated proposal to implement mobility funding. Staff's proposal for the long-term plan for clean mobility investments has been refined based on the May revised budget, and changes have been made as well, which more directly address stakeholder questions and comments. The real focus of today's workgroup meeting is to provide background from our long-term plan workgroup process and solicit additional feedback from all of you on staff's proposed funding splits across projects, as well as funding priorities. I will now provide a short overview of the plan so it's clear what CARB is doing and why it's so important for defining the future of clean mobility investments. Senate Bill 1275 is the legislative driver behind CARB's development of the long-term plan. There are two critical complementary pieces to this process, including vehicle purchase incentives and the ZEV market, or zero emission vehicle market, and clean mobility equity projects, which is what we are discussing today. So clean mobility projects will be described in more detail shortly as a reminder of the scope of what we're talking about here. We've been doing long-term planning for clean mobility investments since fiscal year 2016-17. This is a critical part of the funding plan process to provide visioning for how investments will move forward, what funding projections are, and how these funds can be leveraged most effectively to directly benefit the communities that need them the most. We held a kickoff meeting for the long-term plan back in February and a second meeting in April to provide more detail on CARB's proposal. Today's work group provides specific questions that we would like everyone to be thinking about as we move ahead with these investments. We want to foster dialogue and open conversation that will help us to determine next steps as we finalize the plan. So the core purpose of today is to keep you informed of where we are with our investments and where we are headed by walking you through the proposal. We're seeking additional input for consideration as the plan is solidified. Previous workgroup discussions were based on the January 2022 proposed budget. This included a proposed allocation for clean mobility investments of $65 million for the current fiscal year 22-23. $65 million was part of $419 million over 4 years in the January budget. The May revised budget changed to $419 million as part of an accelerated funding proposal intended to provide relief to communities and make sure that they can have some relief from increasing gas prices. The May revised budget called for $419 million to last fiscal year 21-22 with the intent of accelerating funds in the communities we serve. The budget language was specific in two specific line items. One, a minimum of $110 million is intended to be allocated to the clean mobility options portion of our investments, and a minimum of $122 million is intended to be allocated to clean mobility in schools. Staff are proposing $10 million be set aside for our regional clean mobility projects, given their continued importance and the need to keep services available in communities that need them most. CARB has discretion for the remaining $187 million in proposed funding through the funding plan process, as I will discuss further in the next slide. This portion of the funding does require board approval in November. Based on the May revised budget, staff adjusted proposed funding splits across programs. Proposed funding splits based on a total budget of $419 million are $126 million for the CMO Voucher pilot program, $125 million for clean mobility in schools, and $125 million for the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. And as a reminder, these three make up our existing programs. And $43 million for planning and capacity building grants. The May revised budget included the line items, as I mentioned already, $110 million for clean mobility options and $122 million for clean mobility in schools. These are minimum funding amounts for each project, Additional amounts will require board approval in November. Also important to note that the final budget does not, if for any reason it does not include line items, staff anticipate that we will propose even funding splits across clean mobility options, clean mobility in schools, and the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. Staff's thinking is that at least 10 million of the 126 million for clean mobility options could be allocated to regional clean mobility projects, given the importance and the need to sustain offerings in the communities. Grantees would be eligible to apply for this funding in application window number 2 in support of a completely new project, expansion of current services, or continuing the existing funded project for implementing long-term sustainability. We, of course, welcome feedback as to whether or not it makes sense. With these proposed funding allocations, CARB anticipates we could fund approximately 37 clean mobility options project vouchers, 12 to 15 clean mobility in schools projects, 12 to 15 sustainable transportation equity projects, and approximately 75 to 180 planning and capacity building grants. This is based on current size and scope, and really is intended to show the magnitude of impacts this funding can have on mobility projects. Also, up to 1% or 4 million of the 419 million total budget can be used for state operations, which would support mobility investment implementation. We do not explicitly call that out here in the table on the slide, but wanted to make sure that everyone is aware. We anticipate more information on 1% funding to be included in the draft funding plan as it relates to our broad suite of clean transportation investments. The 4 million that was included in staff's original proposal that was back in the last work group meeting was split across the 4 project categories here evenly. We would like to have discussion next on the content we have shared thus far. Let me go here though. We have a couple of discussion questions here as it relates to staff's proposal for funding splits between programs. So one, we want to really get a sense, are these proposed funding splits sensible? Do they make sense based on the May revised budget and acceleration of funding into fiscal year 2021-22? Also, would love your feedback on, are there specific project elements that need to be prioritized in order to maximize community benefits? It's not on the slide specifically, but the other area where we would love your feedback is on the proposed minimum of 10 million being allocated to regional clean mobility projects. So with that, let's see if there are any specific raised hands or questions in the QA that we can address here.
Okay, not seeing any raised hands. We do have a question in the Q&A. Can you please repeat how many projects are envisioned per classification?
Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate that. Okay, so specifically, I'm assuming the question was related to how many projects we anticipate we can fund based on the staff's proposed funding splits. I think that's what I heard. So what we had mentioned was 37 for the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot, 12 to 15 projects for the Clean Mobility in Schools project, and also 12 to 15 for the Sustainable Transportation Equity project. And then 75 to 180 projects potentially for planning and capacity building grants, of course, depending on the scope and size, as well as the process that we take going forward. Thanks for the great question.
Okay, and we have a raised hand now from Caroline Rodier. Caroline, I will unmute your line and you're free to talk.
Hi, I'm not quite clear on you. So you're talking about the regional projects, and those are regional legacy projects that have been funded in the past that are still ongoing. And I guess you mentioned that it could be funded by a new CMO grant, but then I think you also mentioned there would only be $10 million for those. Is that correct? For those projects? I guess I'm just a little confused.
Yeah, so in the past, we have set aside funding in the funding plan for what we considered expanding the existing projects. And we've kind of gone back and forth and naming them either regional or legacy, but they are the 6 projects that were funded with the first 2 solicitations that CARB held many years ago now. And so what we're proposing out of the clean mobility options portion of 126 million, that at least 10 million be set aside for helping to get those projects continue if they would like to apply. The mechanism would be different than before. Some of those grants have ended, and so we can't restart those grants. So the mechanism would be for those project partners to apply directly through the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot. And we're working with CalSTART and the administration team to develop a very streamlined process to enable those funds to get out in a much quicker time frame, because you guys are already moving these projects forward. And okay. I think
Sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, so I just had another kind of follow-on question. So, and you would still limit it to 10 million, even if, say, the regional project was expanding, say, to another area? I mean, would you, say some elements that had been developed in a previously funded project were expanding to another area, that would be still limited to 10 million?
So what we're proposing is a minimum of 10 million. And so one of the questions is, should that number be higher? Recognizing that new communities would not have the opportunity to apply for those funds since they're going to existing communities. The other option that we're opening it up on the voucher program is that the existing projects can apply to the other funding that's available too. What we're trying to do is ensure that there's a minimum of 10 million that the 6 projects can apply for if they would like to. But there are other opportunities to apply through STEP or Clean Mobility in Schools or the other portion of Clean Mobility Options Vouchers, depending on the scope and the size.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And I think I answered Zach Franklin's questions on, can you clarify what you mean when you say existing CMO projects can apply for additional funding? And would that be a competitive process? Ooh, the second part of that is a good question. Can that be a competitive process? So the voucher program is not a competitive process, but one of the questions we'll need to figure out is how much would we allow each of the 6 projects to apply for? So there may be different needs, but it would not be a competition. What we would try to do is try to come up with a common or a max cap that each could apply for. So one of the questions is 10 million enough for those 6 projects, or do we need to raise it? And then what will we consider being the eligible funding cap? Because, we don't want one project to utilize the whole 10 million and leave the other 5 communities out.
Okay, we have a couple more raised hands here. Stephanie Chart, oh, I don't want to butcher your name here. I'm going to unmute your line and you'll be free to talk.
Hello, this is Stephanie Charkovitz with the Sacramento Air District. I'm the lead staff implementing the Our Community Car Share Sacramento program. Just to kind of follow up with what the discussion that was just happening, and I think it's fantastic that CARB is looking at the set aside for these legacy projects, because I think I can speak for all of them saying that sustainability is a difficult nut to crack in these communities, and we're all working very diligently to achieve that. And additional funding is absolutely required as we work towards that goal. My feedback would be that we need to raise that 10 million cap to provide opportunity for all of the projects to have enough funding to get closer and to achieve that sustainability goal. Because if you were to divide those funds up amongst the 6 projects, it really doesn't, it's less than 2 million per project, which when you're trying to continue to innovate and keep the projects going, unfortunately, that I don't think those funds would go very far for each of the projects. So I would recommend increasing that amount so that each project has the ability to get what they need to continue functioning and work towards sustainability.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for joining us today. Yeah, it has been a huge hurdle for you guys, and I appreciate all of your work and your project partners' work on getting us to this point. Is there a certain amount that you could foresee that your organization or your communities would want to help get to that sustainability point?
Yeah, what we're finding is that because we have to apply or we have to renew our funds every few years, that we're having a hard time forecasting into the future. So being able to have funding that extends out for several years would allow us more time to focus on that longer term plan and be able to work towards the goal instead of the constant search for funding and the work to continue to achieve said funding. So my feedback would be to provide several years worth of funding or the opportunity. Of course, for my project, I would want several years of funding and get it allocated each year as a guarantee rather than one big lump sum with a short timeline. I'm not sure what other projects would like in that realm. I know that keeping the projects going is a piece of it. And so, a minimum of 2 million per year for, of course, pie in the sky, let's ask for 4 or 5 years worth to be able to get to a point where we can say this project can function on its own with the community support, and we can kind of let it go and flourish on its own.
I appreciate that. One of the benefits I see in the governor's proposal to accelerate this funding is it would definitely allow us to provide the opportunities for longer term support and planning for not only the existing projects, but for new ones that are coming on board. And we're going to explain some of those proposals later on, and I'll just cover one of, actually I won't, but I appreciate your feedback, Stephanie.
Okay, no more raised hands at this time. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. Can you please redefine the Clean Mobility in School project?
We will be talking about our mobility investments, including clean mobility in schools, in the next portion of the slides. And so I just wanted to reiterate that, because otherwise I'll be repeating it multiple times, but that is focused on public school districts. So it's a very unique pilot project currently within 3 school districts of the state. Also supports lawn and garden equipment as well. So it's really exciting. Lots of great lessons have been garnered from that project.
Jeff Morris asks, what do you envision as the balance between rural and urban priorities and rulemaking? Well, since this is an incentive program, we don't, that are supposed to support rulemaking. We're not really focused on the rulemaking portion of it, but we are looking at both urban and rural as the community, a lot of communities that need funding. So when we do implementation work groups where we talk about funding splits, that'll be one thing we'll discuss. With clean mobility options later on in this presentation, we will be talking about prioritizing funding splits. And so that is a great question for that particular part of the presentation. David Park asked a follow-up question. Thank you for the project numbers. Perhaps at the next workshop, could staff provide case studies of projects in each of the funding categories, or how staff conceives of the types of projects envisioned per category? So great question. What we have done in the past funding plans, and we can put a link in the chat, is we've described each of the projects and the level of funding and some of the benefits that they've achieved. We're drafting a funding plan to be released in early July for the July 22nd or July 21st final workshop for the funding plan. In that draft funding plan, we'll have additional information providing the background for our analysis on how many projects we expect to get funded through each of the three categories and the planning and capacity building grants. One thing to note is clean mobility options usually focuses on lower cost or smaller projects, whereas clean mobility in schools and the STEP project are larger projects. So that's why you heard from us, there'd be more CMO projects versus the other two.
I want to jump in too on this, Sam. Tabitha Willman from CARB. We also, and I will put in the chat, have our projects in action web pages, which if you want any more information on any of the projects themselves, each project has its own web page where we highlight an overview of the project, what some of the highlights of that project have been, what some of the lessons learned have been. So that's a great place to just go learn more about the projects in case you're interested in those. So I'll drop that in the chat too.
Thanks, Tab. Jeff Morris has another statement. To clarify, rural areas will need infrastructure investments that may not have the per capita benefit of urban/suburban areas, but still have a significant need and include their own equity issues with high levels of poverty in many areas. Totally, completely agree from what we've heard from communities throughout the state, including rural areas. There's a lot of issues to address that are unique, and we're trying to provide as much flexibility in all three of these programs as we can to address those issues. One other thing to highlight is that these programs cost a lot of money. And so when we're looking at the benefit per cost, which is something that we've been asked to include in the funding plan, you'll see that these projects do cost more than, say, a vehicle purchasing incentive that goes directly to the consumer. But we also look at it as these are community-based programs, not just household-based. So that's something that we'll need your feedback and support on if you want us to continue proposing to make these investments in the funding plan. So I appreciate the comment.
Okay, we have a couple more questions in the Q&A from Ariana Walker. Is this an invite-only process for prior partners?
I can take a couple of these questions since they seem to be all related to our regional or legacy projects. So just to clarify, this is, as Sam mentioned, this is our proposal for a set-aside guaranteed funding. This is not a cap. To answer your question, Arliana, no, this is not an invite-only process. Moving forward, funding will only be granted for those projects who apply through the CMO Voucher Pilots Program. So regional projects, they need to apply like everybody else through the CMO when application window opens. The only difference is that we are proposing to have some guaranteed set-aside funding. So when they are coming to the queue, when the set-aside funding is oversubscribed, they can still be in a queue and get funded if we are still having fund from our general pot. I hope this is a little more clear now. Pled Cannon, you asked what will be the funding cap for those applying for CMO voucher who have completed a CMO assessment. I will go through our proposed set-aside funding later in the presentation. We do have some proposal for our needs assessment awardees who have completed their needs assessment. Zach, you had a follow-up comment that about our window one mobility project voucher awardees. Yes, again, we do have a proposal set aside for them. And these set asides, to clarify, only will be possible if we receive additional funding, by the way. We do have some proposal for them. I will go over that during my presentation later on.
Thanks, Dava. We have one more raised hand from Gloria Huerta. You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Gloria Huerta with NeoCarve. Just wanted to comment that I think it's great that CARV is interested in funding legacy projects. But I guess a question I have is, have you thought about what the reimbursement process would look like? As someone that benefited, from the initial funding for NeoCarve, which is now considered a legacy project, I think there have been issues with the reimbursement process. So is that something you guys have already thought about, what it would look like? And then if you have a time frame of how long you will know when the funding will become available?
I can tackle both of those. Regarding when the funding will become available, it's dependent on really two things. One, right now, the governor's proposed budget does have a line item for clean mobility options, along with clean mobility in schools. Those are minimums that will be discussed a little bit later. If the budget passes once it's signed, then we can enter into grants with our administrator team to get at least the clean mobility options funding out more quickly. If those line items are taken out and it's just one overall budget for $419 million, then we would have to wait until after our board approved the funding plan in November. After that point, then we would work with our administrator team and for this particular project to get that funding included. Regarding the disbursement process, we're working hard with our administrator team to try to minimize the hurdles that folks have had to go through and are experiencing to try to get that funding out as quickly as possible once expenses are incurred.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have another raised hand from Jill Sherman. Jill, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. and I apologize, I was on another call, so I'm late and maybe you've already discussed it. Yesterday, I learned that the CVAP program has pretty much been halted because I don't know if it was a matter of these new and improved or whatever you're doing, reorganizing, but I'm really disenchanted and disillusioned about how CARB is effectively trying to service low income and disadvantaged communities by basically unfunding a program and where they have had to lose many of their staff as a result. So now we're almost a year behind, and I'm really not sure about the purpose of it being a year behind. I also want to make sure that and I know that someone said that CMO is going to be the next, but I think we need to take a long, hard look at it. How that program's funded, because I had a call the other day, and then I went and looked at the CalSTART organization, and I was looking at the board of directors, and I'm really puzzled by how that particular organization was funded, because it seems more like an industry organization versus a real nonprofit that works within and understands low-income and disadvantaged communities. And as many of you may or may not know, I have been working on providing outreach to, heading back to the CVAP, to tribal communities in rural areas about that program. And there have been many difficulties along the way, and I felt like we were just getting to a point of ironing some of those issues out. And I've also felt for a long time, for at least 2 years now, that the program was underfunded administratively. So I really feel like that we need the end user to be involved in some of these discussions so that you understand the difficulties that have already existed in this program. And now it's almost like the programs are being erased. And I'm extremely unhappy about that. So I don't know if there's anything anyone could answer about why the CVAP program has basically been gutted. At least until this, I guess it's until this process is over, but I'm really feeling very disillusioned by the work that CARB is doing to actually implement these programs and reach a zero net carbon by 2045. Thank you.
Appreciate your participation, Jill. The Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, the CVAP program, which you're referring to, is not one of the projects we're talking about today. I believe there's another work group coming up that they will be another number of work groups. I also see Elisa is raising her hand, and we can have her address that particular comment. Regarding your other comment, as far as CalSTART is concerned, we held a competitive solicitation a few years ago for the Clean Mobility Options Program that was open for nonprofit organizations and government agencies to apply for to administer these funds. And so they were awarded the funds to administer this program through that competitive solicitation process. And during that process, we reviewed applications from a number of entities, and they were scored as the highest one, and that's how they were awarded the funding for this.
I hear you, Sam, but I am, the problem I have is when you go and look at the board of directors, they're an industry-based program, and they also have this mission for financial prosperity, which I'm assuming for themselves. So it seems very disingenuous. And I think and I don't even see where they have had a lot of experience dealing with low income and disadvantaged communities. And I, as a person who one time in my life was on general assistance and, was using, it used to be called food stamps, but CalFresh, I think you need to have those experiences to be able to serve those communities. And I would really stress that in the future, when you're looking at agencies to do this kind of work, that you put a priority on their knowledge and experience in working within those communities.
Appreciate your comment.
This time. Sorry, thank you.
And Lisa, I've got you unmuted.
Great, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Jill. The comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I coming through okay now?
You muted yourself, but now we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry again. Thanks. Jill, you raised really good issues. And I think, as we continue to think about solicitations, finding ways to improve the way we score applications, especially around proven and demonstrated experience in working with communities, is a great comment. And that's something we will continue to do for all of our projects as we're building our solicitations. So thank you for that. Regarding the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, I share in your frustration. We're, as you know, we received small amounts of funding for that program, and that program, the statewide financing assistance program, really took off a whole lot faster than we expected it to, given that it was a low income focused program, and a pilot of sorts, while we were trying to test out how to manage a program that offered the on the hood grant plus the financing and the education along with it. And what we saw in that program is that the funding it got eaten up too quickly. And as you know, we've been working towards trying to develop a needs-based approach to keep that from happening. And I know that there are a lot of folks really frustrated that we haven't reopened the program yet. But our fear is that if we were to open the program right now in the way that we've had the program previously structured, the small amount of money we have about 12 to 15 million only at the moment, that money would be gone very, very quickly. And so we are trying to take a hard look at how we can structure the program in a way that ensures the funding is there for low-income consumers and consumers in communities that have not been able to benefit from these projects before in the past. Make sure the money is there for them and make sure that the process works for them. And so it is taking a little bit longer than we'd hoped, but we do hope to have the program up and running before the end of this year. We're working hard to do that. We're also working in partnership with our Clean Cars for All folks to find ways to consolidate and make sure that our administrators are working together hand in hand so we can really bring that application process together and make the programs more accessible and ensure that they're reaching the consumers we intend them to reach. So again, I appreciate the comment. We share in your frustration. We're doing our best to try to redefine the program as quickly as we can, but as thoughtful as we can too, so that when we do relaunch, we're comfortable that we are reaching the intended consumers.
Well, and like I said, I actually think I've been working in the outreach for this program for 3 years. And when I first found out about it, I just want to share this experience. I was telling my husband, I was super excited about the CVAP program and the rebate program. And I thought, man, this is fantastic. This could be so meaningful to someone who is struggling financially to even have a car. Like, this would be very helpful to get them into that price, because as we all know, people look at electric vehicles as something that only wealthy people own. And immediately, I started providing feedback just based on my own experience. And I'm like, this program isn't set up to do it. So I told my husband about it. And he said, like, oh, talk to our good friend. We have a friend, because he was talking about that program. Well, then I find out that that our good friend had known about the program 3 years before, because he's like, oh yeah, it's a great program. I get the incentive and the rebate, and every year I've been able to upgrade my my hybrid. He goes, how did you think I was doing that? And I said, well, I don't know, because I do know that he had gotten 3 vehicles once a year. Well, he was using this program. And in fact, he was waiting for the next rebate to come through. And he's like, oh, if you're working with it, find out I've been waiting almost 9 months for my last rebate to come through. And I was like, what? So again, the end users, I think their experiences are really important. I was very frustrated because I've been frustrated with, and I understand the need to verify through the IRS that people's incomes are what they say they are, but that process is very long. And just in the last year, we lost 2 people from purchasing electric vehicles or even hybrids because the process was so slow. And we've been providing good inputs to it into the existing program. And my concern is that it's not going to move forward. The other issue that I have with the Clean Cars for All is San Diego, for example, is an air district that has been allowed to get away with, and I say get away with, like they've faced no kind of punishment, and I'm not sure if it's punishment I'm looking for, but they should have had some sort of explanation as to why they didn't offer the Clean Cars for All. And again, through the rumor mill, my understanding was that the air district down there servicing San Diego was like, oh, well, there's not enough money and people really wouldn't be interested in it. And again, that comes from a place of being wealthy minded, meaning that they don't live the experience of a low income and disadvantaged person. So they think, oh, nobody really is interested in getting $500 for their car. I'm sorry. Yes, if you are making, living a family of 5 and trying to live on $30,000 a year, yes, you'll be interested in $500 for your car. So, I don't think CARB has done a very good job at making sure that every air district absolutely has to implement their Clean Cars for All and not give poor excuses that they don't have enough staff, because in the world that I come from, a salaried individual is expected to work a minimum, especially if they're exempt. If it's an exempt salaried person, they should be working a minimum of 40 hours. That means if you work 60 hours, well, you're still paid for the 40 because you're exempt. So, making people have to do these things. And I think, allowing air districts to not offer those programs is just, it's wrong. And I'm sorry I'm coming out so strong, but I just feel very frustrated because I've learned a few things this last week that just kind of dishearten me. So thank you.
No, thank you, Jill. And, I'd love to circle back to you on more of this in detail. And we've got a work group coming up on June 22nd on our long-term plan for all of the light duty vehicle purchase incentive programs. So please, if you're available, we'd love to have you participate in that. And I'll reach out. I'd love to follow up and hear a little bit more about the experiences you've been having.
Hi, and I'd like to chime in here just for a second, just to maybe address Jill and your concerns. And Jill, like everything you've been addressing so far, we definitely take into completely into consideration. And we've had conversations in the last week or so with you around some of your concerns with the CML program. And I just want to state that that CalCert is not an industry group, it is a nonprofit organization. And, for the most part, I can't speak on behalf of the organization as a whole, but, they are doing their best to hire the right people. And I'm, I've been hired as a program manager specifically for the CML program because of my background. I come from the grassroots level. I've been doing grassroots work in LA for over 20 years. And, with my experience and, basically my knowledge of these communities, I definitely have a different set of eyes that I'm putting into the work here. And I definitely see your frustration. And I've had similar frustrations in my involvement in this industry and other industries as well. So I definitely can relate to that. And we do have some things that we're working up to boost that. And one of those things is, we are going to be highlighting this a little later, but we're in the process of onboarding an equity consultant that's really going to help us kind of shape some of the work that we're doing, because there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done, and 100% hear you out there.
Thank you.
All right, there's one more comment and then we'll get moving on. We've got a lot of slides to go through. Moses States has written a comment: there needs to be an effort to diversify future projects throughout the state, considering previously funded projects to afford an equal opportunity to other areas of the state, especially rural DACs. Also review data on what works and what does not, so that there are takeaways from future or from previous projects. Thank you, Moses, for your insight. there is a comment that was written in by Mateo. I'll just read it off. The CMO is conducting outreach to inform California disadvantaged communities, both urban, rural, and tribal, to apply for the future window. This includes reviewing current data to support future project applications, project development, and implementation. I'll also add on that this is what the STEP and Clean Mobility in Schools program is targeting, along with what we think the goals for the planning and capacity building grants will help with these communities. With that, I'll hand it back over to Ashley to move the presentation forward.
Yes, I would like to take a moment to provide a recap of materials we covered back in February and April, just to make sure that we're providing continued context and clarity around how we got where we are with staff's proposal. And also just wanted to mention that this next slide is going to get to a lot of the great questions and comments we just heard about our regional pilots and also the Clean Mobility in Schools project. So thanks for being patient. So first and foremost, I want to talk about our regional projects currently underway. So those projects are in Los Angeles, Sacramento, the Bay Area, San Joaquin Valley, and Santa Cruz County, from 2 specific solicitations, fiscal year 2014-15 and 16-17. But to be clear, projects have launched in various neighborhoods in disadvantaged and low-income communities in those areas. Through ongoing implementation of those projects, we've garnered critical lessons that have been directly applied to the other projects that are listed on this slide, including the Clean Mobility Options Voucher pilot and our other programs. So CMO, the intent here, as we've discussed before, is to address Senate Bill 350 Low-Income Barriers Report community input and the need to streamline statewide access to mobility funding with the goal of improving under-resourced communities' access to clean mobility options that are safe, reliable, convenient, and affordable. Clean Mobility in Schools, which I know there were some questions on here a little bit ago, addresses unique clean mobility needs of schools and maximizes emissions benefits across sectors, such as school buses, infrastructure, lawn and garden equipment, and educational curriculum, with the intent of boldly transforming school communities and increasing awareness, as well as accessibility to clean technology, promoting mode shift and maximizing emissions reductions as well. The Sustainable Transportation Equity Project addresses community identified transportation needs via more flexibility, larger projects, and community involvement with the goal of increasing transportation equity in under-resourced communities. We foresee that our clean mobility funding will be focused on CMO, Clean Mobility in Schools, and STEP, as well as the planning and capacity building grants mentioned here, as the primary drivers and the foundation for community investments. This is reflected in the long-term plan proposal we'll be walking you through, and CARB is focused on working to improve our investments as they evolve to get to a lot of the feedback we heard. And these existing programs provide a good basis and starting point for that to happen. So one critical element of our work is making sure that we provide information on our clean mobility investments in a way that's transparent to the broader public. So this includes documentation on lessons learned and other critical information on our programs. So this slide really is intended to provide critical links to everyone to make sure that you have them handy as we're talking about our projects. We encourage using these resources to keep track of the latest project information that's out there, as well as highlights from our projects that Tab mentioned earlier, but you can also reach out to staff directly anytime. So these slides might look familiar to folks who attended our last work groups, but these are clean mobility investment objectives. And these are intended to actively reflect the concerns raised for how we make projects financially sustainable beyond CARB funding provided, but also prioritizing critical elements of our clean transportation programs, such as workforce training and development, and other items as key equity principles in mobility investments. We also want to reflect on comments specific to prioritizing investments in Black communities, Asian American communities, and other communities of color. We want to make sure our outreach strategies, as well as the methods we're taking, of investing in these communities impacts those most underrepresented. So based on the feedback, we have more information to share on demographics of our investments today. So that will be later on in the slides. And we'll continue to share this information through the funding plan process moving forward. Our clean mobility investments are intended to build upon lessons learned and complement one another in pursuit of equity goals. Each program serves a specific and very unique purpose. For example, CMO focuses on smaller, shared mobility services and community transportation needs assessments. Clean Mobility in Schools focuses on the clean transportation needs of public school districts. STEP focuses on larger set of clean transportation and supporting projects that address residents' transportation needs and also reduce vehicle miles traveled. One of the key recommendations we have heard is to streamline the mobility grant application process across programs and to simplify based on size and scope of our projects. This will be a critical consideration. One potential avenue to assist with this is looking for ways to better align existing programs as we go out with new solicitations. Documenting and sharing lessons learned will continue to be part of our process. One example of how this is already happening is through the development of the Clean Mobility Equity Alliance, where current mobility project grantees, practitioners, and others can come together to share their experiences in implementing programs. Prioritizing investments in underserved communities is key, but we do have to balance investments geographically and find ways, even when we're moving ahead with our existing programs, to ensure that new communities can also access these funds. Even with more funding than we've had in previous years, we will need to prioritize. Part of this will be direct outreach and engagement in Black communities and communities of color and other impacted areas, for example, rural communities, which was mentioned earlier, and tribal communities as well. CARB's core approach to developing the long-term plan is taking a deeper dive into the feedback we've received to date for projects, and also implementation of these projects since that began back in 2014-15. This, as well as ongoing feedback, especially from those using the mobility services, will help CARB to determine the best way forward that will allow for the desired transition from pilot programs to community-based and centered equity programs. This kind of transition in scale and reach of our projects requires analysis of investment gaps and mobility programs are implemented over time, including progress on implementing Senate Bill 350 low-income barriers report recommendations and accelerating our investments in such a way that expands services offered and allows for more equitable outcomes, such as diversified investment in impacted communities statewide. CARB is aware that clean mobility investment gaps do exist when it comes to both demographic and regional geographical reach of our projects. It's important to acknowledge that there's more that needs to be done here to maximize access and benefits from these projects. Analysis and review of lessons is critical to our long-range investment planning and determining how the future of transportation can better meet community needs. Addressing gaps has been raised in all of our work groups thus far and has also come up with other discussions that CARB has had with our stakeholders. We heard the need to invest further in Black communities and consider the unique needs and capacity concerns with tribes and rural areas. Analysis is meant to be fluid and ongoing. Thus, we continue to welcome additional suggestions, including where we can leverage existing projects to get funds out to communities sooner, or for example, what flexibility is needed through planning grants to cover the cost of community projects not covered within CMO, Clean Mobility in Schools, or STEP. In our last work group meeting, April 19th, we heard strong support for forming an equity-centered group to participate in mobility project design, selection, and implementation. This was raised as an idea and not something that was set in stone. We're interested to hear more on how something like this could work or be structured to conduct equity review and evaluation across our programs that allows for specific improvements and policy changes. Some critical needs staff have identified that could be covered through this effort include documenting and reporting out on lessons learned as we administer and implement programs, and also building upon the evaluation efforts and research contracts that have already been done to identify any critical gaps that can support equity outcomes. If this is being done through other programs you are aware of, or you have specific advice on who should be involved in thinking through this concept, or in the group itself, we would definitely welcome that feedback anytime. So here we have some discussion questions. And again, we may not spend too much time on this, but the intent was just to really take a look at our audience and figure out what the specific interests are. We've heard a lot of great questions earlier that can kind of give us a good sense of that already. But for folks who are interested, we'll take a couple minutes here. Why are you here today? What clean mobility programs interest you most? Is there something specific that CARB can do from your perspective to support communities we have not invested in yet? And how can CARB increase access to funding for African-American communities and communities of color? So I'll leave it here for just a few moments to see if folks have any specific comments or questions they want to ask.
Okay, we have a couple raised hands here. Marissa Sagala, your line is unmuted.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry about that. I'm Marisa Sagala. I'm with Sagala Inc., and I'm a partner on the Ecosystems project as well as working on a STEP grant in Stockton. Mostly, I just wanted to say that in order to reach communities that you haven't invested in yet, or African American communities or any communities of color, and if you want to involve small businesses, CBOs, all of those types of entities, you need to make the process easier. Applying for these grants, applying for this money is incredibly onerous. I mean, we've had on our team folks from UC Davis. We had to create a program just to answer questions and portions of the application. And smaller groups, they just don't have those resources. And so it's not equitable to apply for these monies, not to mention the way that you get reimbursed for the money you spend, even though you're granted this money, and then you're required to spend the money first to be reimbursed. That requires a level of a deep pocket that not many people have, and it puts a lot of pressure on small businesses, small groups, newly formed entities in order to be able to fulfill their commitment to these contracts. So I feel like there needs to be some communication about that, and possibly some steps to resolve those issues, which I feel like we constantly bring up, but I don't feel like they're being addressed.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for your feedback. We really appreciate that. I didn't know if anyone had anything specific they wanted to add, but I definitely want to highlight some of the things you mentioned about making sure to make the process easier. Definitely a key theme as part of developing this plan, as well as incorporating, some of the concerns of small businesses statewide as well, which has been a consistent theme and great piece of feedback we've heard through the process.
Okay, we have another raised hand from Arliana Waller. Arliana, your line is unmuted.
Hi, thank you. My name's Arlena Waller, and I want to first and foremost agree with Marissa when it comes to the reimbursement. A lot of time we've been doing the work, volunteering most of the time, so you don't have the resources to build the capacity. So it makes it very challenging in these situations. Also, another thing that I think that you all can do, and again, like Marissa, we got a TA, a grant from the city of Bakersfield, which allowed us to put a team together to work 8 months to complete our application, which we ultimately won a CARB planning grant, and we're working with Violet in Bakersfield, California. But it was way out of our capacity had we not had that. So you said there's something specific that CARB can do to support communities we have not invested in. Provide a TA. I think that would really help. And how do we frame and shape our application? And then how do we implement and report? All those things are critically important, because while these communities we're in is important and they haven't been invested, so we haven't been at the table. I think another idea how CARB can increase access to funding for African-American communities. First and foremost, I want to say thank you for being very specific in your language, because when they say people of color, typically it drops African-Americans out of the bottom. So I really want to thank you for being very intentional in your language. How can you do that? Seek out those organizations and invite them to the table, because a lot of times we didn't know that we can do this. Violet invited me to this conversation. I thought this conversation was larger than our work, but it actually aligns with our work. So I think that's a way that you can be really intentional about being inclusive by making that invitation. So those are my ideas, and thank you for the opportunity.
Great ideas. Thank you so much. I definitely want to touch on a couple of things you said quickly, and we will cover some of this as well in the presentation. When it comes to technical assistance, we agree with you. It is so essential to all of these investments. So earlier when we were talking about the 43 million for planning and capacity building, I just want to highlight that that also includes a very intentional, portion of funding for technical assistance as well. That's the vision. How we're reporting, definitely. How we're evaluating, these are all so critical to the process. And you mentioned making sure that we invite the right folks to the table. So I'd love to hear some ideas on specific organizations or groups that you have worked with in the past that you would recommend. And thank you again for all of the great feedback.
Okay, we have another raised hand from Joy Massey. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joy Massey, and I am program manager for one of the legacy projects in kind of coordination with MTC. And I guess that's part of why I'm here today, but really want to speak on, I think, the last bullet point and maybe address some other points after that. Again, I echo the sentiments of Arlena and Marissa in terms of what does it mean to increase access and funding for Black communities. I think there needs to be a little bit more rigor and thinking around this, right? Because as we all know, displacement is a real thing. And so looking at the neighborhood level might not be the best option here or indicator, because we know that just individuals, Black people in particular, are displaced. And so what does it mean to invest in individuals, like Black people as individuals? And so I think just a little bit more thinking on what does it mean to reach folks, and just again, echoing and elevating the sentiments of Arlena and Marissa, pragmatically, that looks like working with organizations that historically have served Black people and continue to serve Black people, and have ideas on kind of what that can look like. So I'm glad that this, again, is a topic of conversation, but I think just a little bit more thought around what does it mean to work in Black communities, as unfortunately, communities are, kind of separated and folks are really displaced, right? So that's the comment that I wanted to address first, and just echoing the technical assistance piece and, ideas around what does it mean to support organizations, community-based organizations prior to any application window being open, right? And really helping people understand that this is something that they can actually CMO, this is funding that they can apply for prior to an application window being open, right? So what does it mean to potentially invest, pair organizations with technical assistance, who knows, a year or two before application window opens? And what does that like technical assistance looks like? And so then when an application window is open, like folks are ready and can apply. So just some other ideas of how to think about technical assistance and kind of capacity building, so that these dollars really are invested into communities that really need them the most.
Joy, thank you. I think you definitely hit the nail on the head here, and we agree with your comments. And thank you for making the time to come today. We really appreciate it. Your work on the car sharing and mobility hubs project has been so important.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Audrey.
Sorry, I just want to address some of the comments that we just heard very quickly. I really appreciate, I'm sorry that I forgot the name, but so about reimbursement process, I just want to mention that I know you have been brought this issue up over and over, and it's not about that we're not listening or we're not doing anything about it. This is advanced payment regulation, and we are trying to work around that regulation to see if there are any approach that we can take to make sure that we can pay our grantees and our sub-grantees as soon as, as the best way as possible, the easiest way as possible. Unfortunately, we cannot pay in advance, and we have to do the reimbursement just because of that regulation. But one of the ways that we're trying to do for specifically for Clean Mobility Options Program, for those that they have problem with, the cash flow, is that we are trying to help them to go to direct registered vendors to buy their vehicles and equipments, and then we pay those vendors directly. So they don't have to, applicants, they don't have to pay out of their pocket to buy vehicles and equipments as long as they go to those registered vendors. So there are some ways that we are trying to incorporate into our programs. Again, thank you so much for your feedback.
All right, we've got 3 comments in the question and answers that I'll run through. Cindy Durisco, are you going to discuss steps that are being done to deal with issues brought up in these pilot programs? Great question. Yeah, we do have a section on the Clean Mobility Options Program later on in the presentation where we're going to be talking about the specific and how we've addressed, or how we're attempting to address them in the next funding window. Regarding STEP and Clean Mobility in Schools, they're in the beginning days of implementation. We're still learning, so we don't have as much information on those programs, but program staff can mention that later on. Russell Teal asks, is there a conflict of interest in sitting on an advisory board and getting grants? Great question. I don't have a great answer at this particular moment, but if we do come up with some type of advisory group, that's something we'll have to address at that particular point. And then Moses states, based on the discussion, there needs to be an application process that is not so onerous and complicated, requesting too much information that is not really necessary. I would reevaluate the purpose and spirit of the program versus the overburden of documentation beyond minimum requirements for fiscal and operational minimums. Completely agree. We're doing our best, and as you'll see in the presentation later on, some steps we're attempting to take with the Clean Mobility Options Voucher project to make it less onerous and to minimize what documentation we're trying to we're collecting, while also ensuring that we're meeting our statutory requirements or our program guideline requirements. So again, appreciate those questions. And last one, Karen Eggerman just listed, our research suggested that having the state programs pay for a staff person at a CBO, like a highly trained staff on a program like Clean Cars for All, would be a good way to help local communities. Last check, Bay Area had 2 people who would help with the CC4A application, or the Clean Cars for All application. Totally agree, and it's something we're going to address later on in the presentation on the planning and capacity building grant. So appreciate everyone's comments.
Thanks, Sam. So I think we'll move to the evaluation of investment progress and benefits portion of the agenda. And just a reminder, this is intended to build upon what we shared in the last work group in April, but to provide some specific examples of how and what we are evaluating for our mobility projects, because there were a lot of questions on this. This will be central to what CARB reports in the annual funding plan process as well. So let's first discuss metrics. This is an ongoing conversation based on the need to confirm benefits to communities and the desire to take more action to address the California State Auditor findings and other program evaluation concerns through continued surveys as well as analysis. Clean mobility project metrics include quantitative as well as qualitative measures for assessing investment progress, as well as community benefits such as socioeconomic and other quality of life improvements as mentioned. In order to be able to break down the complicated nature of our mobility investments and the benefits that they produce, we've worked with third parties to conduct evaluations and investment assessments. We do rely on our grantees as well, administering our programs as the third-party evaluators and contracts to help us assess and define the parameters around what we measure and the progress against our goals of increasing clean transportation access as well. For example, clean mobility services rely on user surveys and focus group discussions conducted by grantees at the community level. This is where much of our information on the demographic portion of our investments will come from. Thus, we're working as best we can to align surveys across programs so that we are asking for project information and in a more consistent way that can measure against the same baseline. CARB works to evaluate mobility program outcomes and community benefits by measuring those outcomes, such as service usage against investment objectives specifically, which are to increase clean transportation access, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and criteria pollutants, but also reduce vehicle miles traveled to support our sustainable community strategy implementation. Reporting elements include, but are not limited to, greenhouse gases, jobs supported by the project, vehicle miles traveled, as I already mentioned, quantity of trips and the number of users, socioeconomic benefits and behavioral change, and community engagement and outreach. We also document the quantity of trips that are taken by the users. This part of our annual reporting process is what we're doing regularly, and the data we want just to be out there transparently to the broader public as part of the funding plan process. So that's really the goal. Evaluation tools that are used across our clean mobility equity projects include vehicle telematics data, feedback from voluntary participant surveys, reporting activities and outcomes by project grantee, and evaluation of project effectiveness using socioeconomic benefit analyses to monetize the benefits from clean mobility programs. At the onset of a project, a participant is assigned a member ID, which would allow survey and telematics data to be collected at an individual level without sharing or compromising a member's personally identifiable information. So this is really key to the data collection process for our mobility programs to ensure that things are kept anonymous and that sensitive user information is protected. Mobility projects are required to incorporate vehicle and equipment telematics into the project design and report outcomes on a quarterly basis. Depending on the project, data reporting may include the number of reservations, hours reserved, vehicle miles traveled, average vehicle utilization rate, and fares or subsidy costs and quantities. This data is essential in understanding how services are used and also the benefits that result. Voluntary participant surveys conducted by project grantees have been vital to understanding the landscape of clean mobility investments since regional projects were implemented back in fiscal year 2014-15. They have assisted us in assessing project outcomes and benefits in communities, and also provide CARB, as well as our program administrators, with data that further supports improvements over time. CARB and grantees continue to ask participants about any issues that they might experience and how we can resolve them. And the goal here is to improve over time. And we also want to refine the questions that we are asking mobility users as well, to dive deeper into socioeconomic benefit and other benefits we measure and assess. Participant surveys fall under 3 general types: initial sign-up surveys, post-trip surveys, and user surveys. Survey participation is strongly encouraged but voluntary in nature. Some of our grantees offer incentives such as lottery drawings for gift cards or free hours of project services in lieu of payment. Demographic information is important in order to characterize the population of users that will be benefiting from project services. So the purpose of the initial sign-up survey is to document users' pre-project travel behavior, including the most common travel modes that are used, and to better understand individuals' current transportation challenges. This is critical for collecting project demographic data. Some examples included here are race, gender, age, primary languages spoken, household income, as well as household size. Additional considerations could be made in the future to capture demographic data based on stakeholder and community input. The purpose of post-trip survey is to obtain feedback from participants on the quality of their experience and to understand the nature of the trip. It also is a means of gaining information on whether trips are shared with other passengers, potentially resulting in VMT reductions, and what transportation choice participants may have made without access to the service. The participant or user survey is given to users after they have had at least 3 months of experience with project services. The purpose of the participant survey is to understand how well people like the service and get direct feedback on areas for improvement. It's also a means of understanding changes in travel behavior and whether project services have improved access to transportation through measurements of reliability, affordability, convenience, and safety. Survey feedback is also used to gauge whether participants feel more comfortable and accepting of clean vehicle technology after using the service. So as discussed, we are very open to feedback on the types of questions, as well as, for example, the kind of demographic data and other data that we're collecting across our mobility project. So just keep that in mind. Survey requirements are an essential part of our mobility investment data collection, and we'll continue to consider what should be measured and assessed given the unique challenges and barriers we are all working to overcome. We're continuing to seek opportunities, as I mentioned earlier in the slides, to align survey questions asked across our programs so that there can be more collective outcomes that represent the full suite of our mobility investments. Grantee activity and outcome reporting is a requirement in all of CARB's projects. Grantees submit quarterly reports documenting project activities such as outreach events, site launches, and new membership signups as well. Telematics data and survey results that fall within the quarter are also typically reported here. Annual reporting is required for job creation and greenhouse gas emission reductions as well. And that's also part of the annual funding plan process. We analyze the project telematics and survey data submitted by the grantees. We work collectively with our grantees to identify and address challenges as they arise and to apply real-time user feedback to improve the outcomes and user experiences overall. One critical thing to note is that we're working internally to conduct socioeconomic benefit analysis consistent with the equity goals of our mobility investments and equally to support the California State Auditor findings. This analysis mentioned here is user-focused to explore ways to monetize these benefits. Transportation projects provide greater benefits than simply the cost savings alone. After all, it would be less expensive for people to stay home rather than go to work, get groceries, or visit the doctor. Providing transportation grants people the access to services that really help to enrich their lives and boost their productivity. In our cost effectiveness measure, we aim to estimate the value of many benefits provided by clean transportation. While not all aspects are included at this time, our new methodology uses market-based valuations for clean transportation and adjustments for the relative need and access of the individual. Including the socioeconomic benefits of clean transportation helps to provide a more complete understanding of the total benefits gained by program participants. As new survey and telematics data does become available, we'll continue to update our methodology to better estimate the benefits as well. So one thing I wanted to mention here is that we have heard in past work groups the concerns with working with the same or similar institutions as we conduct our evaluations and the need to work directly with community-based grassroots organizations. So definitely just want to flag, we've heard those comments. I think it's really important, and that's part of the reason why we propose an equity group as one potential solution. We are funding third-party evaluations that are intended to supplement evaluations conducted by our project grantees. This includes contracts as discussed back in our April work group with the University of California, Berkeley Transportation Sustainable Research Center and the Othering and Belonging Institute, the STEER Group, and the University of California, Los Angeles Institute of Transportation Studies. These contractors are in the earlier stages, so they do not yet have results to report. And I know that was a question that came up in our last work group, so wanted to highlight that here as well. So just really quickly provide a brief summary as a reminder of what these evaluations are. So the UC Berkeley Transportation Sustainable Research Center study uses a hypothesis-based approach to evaluate existing CARB-funded clean mobility projects and to develop an evaluation model for CARB to use as a new standard for assessing effectiveness, sustainability, and outcomes of clean mobility projects. So that's the first one listed here. The Othering and Belonging Institute research is to evaluate existing practices to develop recommendations for equitable, community-based transportation planning, community transportation needs assessments, and more equitable state programming. STEER research is intended to review, identify, and assess financial tools and strategies for sustaining community scale, zero emission mobility services in low income and disadvantaged communities. The UCLA research is intended to improve the understanding of how metropolitan planning organizations select projects for sustainable community strategy implementation. Also worth noting here is there's other evaluations that are happening beyond what we have listed. The Greenlining Institute and other non-contracted entities are doing studies. For example, the University of Southern California and UC Davis is getting funding from the federal government to take a further look at the ecosystems of shared mobility project in the San Joaquin Valley, just to give you a couple of other examples. We will post updates and evaluation deliverables on our website and provide critical information in our yearly updates on mobility investments as part of the funding plan process. So please stay tuned for that. CARB evaluates mobility projects across project phases, which will be increasingly important in long-term planning to ensure feedback is both robust and considering needs and challenges at each step of the mobility investment process. For example, should we be making programmatic changes? And we ask these questions as we develop the funding plan. As projects are implemented, we hold work groups that dive into the weeds on program elements, but also address community level considerations through direct conversations and engagement. We also, as mentioned, have the Community Mobility Equity Alliance through the CMO Voucher Pilot Program, which will hopefully further inform implementation, design, and investment improvements based on shared lessons across grantees and mobility practitioners. CARB wants to better understand and address community outcomes. We want to review the right things and consider what methods make sense, such as specific socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. We want to be conscious of where analysis happens and what actions we take as a result. We're considering Senate Bill 350 low-income barriers report actions as part of this and assessing how well we are increasing access to mobility options based on the needs identified in the community. So central themes for evaluation are program equity and community-driven outcomes, socioeconomic benefits, program effectiveness, and demographic characteristics to assess who has or has not been reached through mobility investments. This is supported through ongoing analysis and identification of funding gaps. We will build out our mapping of current mobility investments and assess where there are additional opportunities we could pursue to serve communities not currently participating in our programs. So with that, we do have another discussion period here. One core question to think about as we do Q&A is, are there specific community evaluation measures or tools that CARB should consider beyond what we are currently leveraging? We talked about user surveys and focus groups, for example, but are there others that work well to evaluate our programs? Please feel free to raise your hand or submit a comment.
And as folks are thinking about it, there were three comments provided in the last section, but I didn't see them get added until we moved on. So I don't see anyone raising their hand. Karen Eggerman had an additional comment. Additional research suggests that financing support in terms of assisting people without good credit scores would be super useful. Many people are paying 12 to 14% APR on loans for used vehicles. It's a great point. As Lisa McCumber mentioned earlier, there's a work group on vehicle purchasing incentives on June 22nd. That comment I think would be a little more applicable, even though it's important where we're looking at providing mobility for folks who can't afford vehicles. Also, Russell Teal asks, why doesn't CARB do its own work instead of fielding it out to CalSTART? Great question. I guess I have a couple of responses. One, our expertise in certain areas is limited. We hire people, we hire engineers and scientists, and with these equity-based programs, we don't have the background that are needed to support communities as well as we could. So when we do competitive solicitations, and we've got a number of administrator folks on this call who are implementing programs on behalf of CARB for communities, they're able to bring in the resources that they need that communities can utilize much more easily than calling me up and trying to get a better understanding of how charging infrastructure installation works. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is the CMO program has been able to fund 44 projects so far, and our capacity to do that is limited for staffing purposes. So those are two reasons. We could have additional discussions offline if you like. And then Creighton Randall asks or makes a comment just to add to previous comments, but especially the need for capacity building, specifically for Black and Brown-led community-rooted nonprofits in both the Blue LA and Ecosystem Legacy projects. Mobility Development Partners has informally developed opportunities for CBOs to be funded for this work, community design, vendor negotiation, outreach, and engagement. But it would be great to see these efforts expanded, formalized, and recognized as core capacity building for a cohort of CBOs rather than exclusively task-based work for specific projects. I appreciate the comments. Creighton will be addressing those in a little bit on the planning and capacity side. There are a few more comments coming in, and the reason I'm reading these comments is because they don't get recorded, rather than us just responding in the comment boxes. I don't see any raised hands, so I'll read the 2 additional comments. One more by Russell Teal. As I understand it, I like the 2-step approach of first doing a transportation assessment and then the second doing an implementation grant, implementing the TNA. Again, we're going to get into more discussion on how we're going to try to build that out with the capacity and planning grants. So thank you for that comment. And then Caroline Rodier suggests that CARB consider implementing control groups and consider indices such as Transportation Security Index to evaluate programs. Happy to discuss online. Appreciate that. Moses State has a comment. Unless there is an evaluation for cost effectiveness for vehicle use, then we will not know the efficiency of the programs. Some basic criteria would entail cost per mile, hour, passenger, and so on. Otherwise, how do you determine sustainability and cost effectiveness? Thank you. Great comment. That's one of the things we're evaluating. We're looking at, we're investing a lot of money into these programs. And so we are looking at cost per mile, cost per hour, trying to get a good grasp on how many passengers there are, as Ashley mentioned on, but there's a lot more that, as far as co-benefits we want to make sure we can capture, because if we just looked at cost effectiveness from a greenhouse gas standpoint, then when comparing them to, say, a different type of program, ours would not be as cost effective. So we're really trying our best to include co-benefits into that analysis. Appreciate everyone's comments. These are great.
Okay, we have a raised hand from Jill. Jill, your line's unmuted.
Hi, I didn't want to take over. So one of the other things that I think isn't really looked at is the utility infrastructure. I think especially in rural communities and in tribal communities, we need to know that the electrical infrastructure can support a new CMO project. For example, if we're going to do something where we have shared cars, or we're putting in plug-in infrastructure, can the utility, we need to know beforehand if the utility can support existing or support placement of such infrastructure. And so I think in your application process, you should probably include or require the inclusion of a letter of support by the local utility, so that there is an understanding before a grant like that is even attempted, that the utility knows that, hey, you've already made a promise or an agreement, a handshake to say, we will make sure that the utility infrastructure is available or is eligible for placement of plugins and other types of infrastructure. I think that's critical, because there's no point in building programs that don't exist. I also think looking at communities in terms of, there is no one organization that's going to have enough experience with the tribal community, the Black community, the Asian community, like the Hispanic community. We need to make sure that because I see contracts. I on another grant program, they have us meeting with these people who are supposedly there to provide us technical assistance. And I spent the hour of my phone call training them on tribal communities. So I was like, and yet they were the tribal equity advisors or whatever. I was just like, how did these people get this? I'm sitting here training them. I should send them a bill. So anyway, I think that's the same for all communities of color. We're all very different in our attitudes and lifestyle. Tribes have, traditional ecological knowledge that might also play a role in building these programs, and we need to make those considerations.
Thank you so much, Jill. All great feedback. I especially liked your point on making sure that the utility can support installation of charging infrastructure. I know that's been a huge challenge across many of our pilot projects and something that I also heard you bring up in the EJAC meeting. So really appreciate you reiterating that here as well. And I think with that, we will move on to the next portion of our agenda item. Ava.
Hello, everyone. Again, thanks for still being here. It's been 2 hours. So I'm going to first provide a quick update on our regional clean mobility project or legacy project. Then I will pass it on to Cesar to go over program updates and key lessons learned from the first window. And I'll talk about some proposed changes for the next application window for CMO and a proposed funding set asides if we receive additional funds from the May revised budget. As a reminder, our regional clean mobility or legacy projects have been implemented since 2014-15. These investments include multiple innovative car sharing and mobility options projects and serve as a foundation for understanding the clean mobility landscape and investment opportunities in communities. Many projects have demonstrated to CARB, as you heard some today, that additional funding will be needed to support financial sustainability efforts in the next 3 to 4 years, and also to avoid stranded assets by allowing services to be made available in the long term. This is why CARB staff are proposing at least 10 million of the 126 million for Clean Mobility Options project be dedicated to regional clean mobility projects to reach these goals, as well as expanding and replicating their successful services in different communities. As I mentioned earlier today, moving forward, funding will only be granted for those projects who apply through the CMO Voucher pilot program. This year is an exciting one for our regional mobility projects. Agricultural worker van pools, ZEV mobility, and ecosystem of shared mobility projects are in their final reporting stages. These reports provide critical lessons that CARB can apply across our suite of mobility investments, and especially for new solicitations that are forthcoming. Blue LA is kicking off its planned expansion this year. CARB anticipates an additional 100 electric vehicles by the end of the year for a total of 185 with 60 chargers. Electric bicycles are also expected to be made available for this project to complement mobility options in 2023. Car share services are anticipated to launch in San Jose and Richmond this summer for the car sharing and mobility hubs and affordable housing pilot project, as well as a bike storage room to complement access to public transit. CARB's more recent clean mobility programs that have been built upon regional investments and Senate Bill 350 low-income areas reports recommendations, as you know, include the clean mobility in schools, sustainable transportation equity projects, and clean mobility options voucher pilot program, or CMO, which we will be discussing shortly. Pass it on to Cesar.
All right, hi. I am Cesar Hernandez, the program manager at CalSTART. The Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot Program provides voucher-based cost reimbursement funding for clean mobility projects and community transportation needs assessment for zero-emission car share, carpool, van pool, bike share, scooter share, innovative transit services, and ride-on-demand services in historically underserved communities. The program is administered by CalSTART and Shared Use Mobility Center in partnership with CivicWell, formerly known as Local Government Commission, and CARB. The program aims to improve underserved communities' access to clean mobility options that are safe, reliable, convenient, and affordable by creating a streamlined application process for communities to apply for funding. The program also seeks further mobility equity, improve local air quality, increase zero-emission vehicle adoption, and reduce vehicle miles traveled, and advance workforce development in clean transportation. Next slide. So CMO offers two types of vouchers: community needs assessment and mobility project vouchers. A main asset of the CMO program is that CMO offers free full-cycle technical assistance throughout the program, from pre-application assistance to and through project planning and implementation. CMO's individualized technical assistance has been well utilized. The program supports awardees through project implementation with capacity building and TA support. CMO has created a capacity building network called the Clean Mobility Equity Alliance, or CMEA, for clean mobility project implementers and stakeholders to support clean mobility project implementation in underserved communities and advance local and regional clean mobility equity solutions. We provide dedicated TA on project implementation, planning, and develop resources to support awardees with project planning, launch, and operations. Some examples of CTNA resources and trainings have included the development of Alchemer survey tools, data analysis and a mapping tool, and communication support and review of outreach materials and flyers. Next slide, please. The CMO support for building community capacity consists of one-on-one assistance, targeted technical assistance from pre-application, contracting, voucher redemption, project implementation and evaluation, peer-to-peer exchange opportunities, small group discussions that yield meaningful results. The Clean Mobility Equity Alliance discussion topics include community engagement, data analysis, communications, data collection, bike share and scooter share, and insurance compliance issues. Capacity building training, training on specific topics allow for broad dissemination and equal access to experts and materials. The training topics include project finance, implementation, evaluation, and reporting. Capacity building tools. There are over 20 project development tools so far. Materials include equity resources, case studies, implementation toolkits, mobility provider directory, and onboarding packets. For the most part, technical assistance is tailored to applicants' needs and delivered through many forms of communication and outreach. Tools include guidebooks, fact sheets, samples, templates, and clean mobility provider directory. We found that voucher applicants and awardees value technical assistance. Next slide, please. So the Window 1 MPV award, so far it's 20 million and up to 1 million per award. We have 20 projects across 11 counties, and the makeup of those projects are 7 nonprofit organizations, 11 project agencies, public agencies, and 2 tribal governments. And as of now, all 20 mobility project agreements are executed. About 9 awardees have done their kickoff meetings and completed their onboarding trainings. So they've already started to work on these projects. The City of Richmond shuttle service, Richmond Moves, is one you see here pictured here that has been launched recently. This is an on-demand shuttle service to bridge transportation gaps and provide connectivity between services and locations in underserved communities throughout the City of Richmond. And we're excited to have more launch events in the coming months. And I'm very excited to attend the next project launch, which is happening in the City of Chula Vista next week. Next slide, please. So Window 1 CTNA overview, the amount awarded total is 1.15 million, and up to 50 per award. There were 24 needs assessments across 14 counties. And again, the makeup of that was 13 nonprofit organizations, 8 public agencies, and 3 tribal groups. And as of now, all 24 community transportation needs assessments have been completed, and assessments have been submitted through their final reports. And as you can see, you know, all the levels of different types of community engagement consisted of 10 different engagement methods, 37 engagements throughout the state with 2,736 engagement total participants, and then 2,604 in person. And just a little over 5,000 total survey responses. Awardees responded to exit surveys asking for input regarding various aspects of the program. Awardees' satisfaction with technical assistance was at 85% of awardees satisfied with the overall process. 87 felt that they are now well prepared for implementation, and 80% were satisfied with technical assistance they received and to complete their assessments. There was 15% that indicated they were neutral. Now, however, as we've been learning on today's meeting, we did also see comments from respondents that indicated their dissatisfaction with aspects of the program, as stated in this comment. In concept, CMO is a great program with great objectives, but the administration of the grant was very challenging, particularly in managing the budget and admin-related requirements. We'll cover some of those lessons learned in the next couple of slides, but the majority of the implementation TA focused on surveys, data collection, data analysis, and voucher reimbursement. Next slide, please. So window one key lessons learned. The application was too complex, too much pressure to submit in a timely manner, internet connectivity and access issues, especially for rural and community applicants. Some concerns about underrepresentation of lead applicants from marginalized communities and lower capacity organizations. Applicants invest a lot of time and resources creating applications with no assurance that they would receive funding. And some awardees were dissatisfied with the voucher reimbursement process due to the administrative requirements and time delay in receiving these payments, yet found technical assistance for voucher reimbursement to be very helpful. Next slide, please. As discussed in previous workgroup meetings, one of our main lessons is that mobility projects take a lot of time, collaboration, and resources to design, develop, and launch. Building partnerships takes time and community capacity upfront from before projects are designed or implemented. Infrastructure takes time to install and often ends up being more expensive than anticipated. Communities often cannot cover upfront costs, and it's certainly more challenging now with substantial costs increase since the program launched. And acquiring insurance has been challenging, especially for bike and scooter share projects. I will end it with this. The administrative team engaged awardees and conducted additional outreach to non-CMO communities to identify lessons learned from window one. We learned these lessons through outreach to underrepresented communities by conducting one-on-one interviews and group listening sessions with communities who did not apply or who were previously aware of CMO. We conducted one-on-one outreach to tribal governments, surveyed CTNA and MPV applicants and awardees. We engaged CTNA awardees during their voucher term through the Clean Mobility Equity Alliance. And lastly, we spoke with regional clean mobility projects to gather implementation feedback. And with that, I will pass it on to Abba.
Thank you, Cesar. So based on window one lessons and talking to awardees, stakeholders, and overall desire to allow for ongoing improvements to meet the clean mobility needs of communities, CARB staff proposed some program changes for window two during last summer that I'm going through them shortly. And in addition, we have more proposed adjustments that we would love to hear your feedback on all of them today. So our proposed improvements to the program that we discussed during two public work groups last summer include, first, increasing the community transportation needs assessment voucher award from $50,000 to $75,000 with 12 months to finish the project rather than 9 months. We are seeking feedback as to whether or not this increase is enough to support concerns raised from original needs assessment voucher recipients on specific portions of the project that could not be funded. CARB and the CMO administrator team heard that $75,000 may not be enough, and it depends on size of the community, scope of the outreach, and survey population. Therefore, a higher CTNA or needs assessment voucher funding limit may be warranted. Second is streamlining our mobility project voucher application in 2 steps. We heard it again today. We need to streamline and simplify our application as much as possible. first step for mobility project voucher application would be just a concept application, which is much shorter and easier to complete, asking for basic eligibility questions. Our goal was to create a less time-consuming application for step 1 or phase 1 of the application, which means under-resourced communities will not be investing a lot of resources into an application that may not be funded in the end. In addition, CalSTART has created an online application, which is more user-friendly. All sections and attachments can be loaded beforehand to relieve that stress with the opening bell submittal. And also it allows for saving progress before the application window opens. As I mentioned earlier, existing CARB grantees and their sub-grantees will now be eligible to apply through the CMO program to support their existing services. To make sure these applicants are eligible for a full award amount like everybody else, we're also proposing to remove the lower voucher cap of $600,000 that we used to have for existing services in Window 1. Eligible project areas are expanded to include all AB 1550 communities. In the first round, we limited eligibility of AB 1550 areas to only affordable housing communities. There will be more time and support provided for awardees and their partners to work on their insurance and to be deemed compliant. And last, we will allow full cost reimbursement for zero emission medium duty vehicles. We're hoping this will remove barriers for applicants, especially rural and tribal communities that are more in need of operating shuttle and microtransit services and do not have enough capital or other sources of funding for these types of vehicles. Next slide. We're also excited to announce that, as Cesar mentioned earlier, an equity consultant is being brought on to support the program administrator team going forward. The team is currently evaluating all the RFP responses. In about a month or so, we're hoping that we should be having a great additional set of eyes to support CalSTART and the admin team by using an equity lens in every step of our program, leveraging and distributing further equity-based tools and resources and identifying any potential equity gaps in our program. We are also working closely with CalSTART accounting team to make sure that the payment process is as streamlined as possible for all of our voucher recipients. This will include reducing paperwork and require supporting documentations as much as possible in order for awardees to get paid quickly, as well as setting up a process to reimburse subcontractors directly. CARB is working with CalSTART to implement other languages for CMO website and tools, as well as administrative personnel to better support the needs for our projects. We're also leveraging opportunities to expand peer-to-peer learning opportunities and participation in the Clean Mobility Equity Alliance CMEA meetings to non-CMO grantees, given the broad learnings that are intended to be shared to improve our programs over time. Next. So from the implementation standpoint, we have certainly learned a lot more compared to last year. Therefore, we have more recommendations for Window 2 to further adjust the program, make it more accessible for applicants, and streamline for our current and future grantees. First one is increasing the mobility project voucher cap from 1 million to 2.5. As we all know, there are critical market conditions that are impacting our projects. Vehicles, equipment have become significantly more expensive since last year. There are supply chain constraints, higher than expected operating expenses, including insurance costs. Program administrator team has done thorough cost analysis to identify how much it would make sense to cover these gaps due to increased costs and barriers that were not expected when we launched the program, or even while we were executing agreements with our Window 1 awardee just a couple months ago. We also want to provide funding for 3 years of operation instead of 2 years. That means the total voucher agreements remains the same as about 5 years, with providing fund for up to 12 to 15 months of planning and construction, plus 3 years of service operation. We're hoping with this additional seed money and support from the grant, by the end of the 4th year, grantees have begun to reach out to the point that they can support 1 more year of operation on their own with the community resource contributions that they have. We understand insurance is very expensive, especially for smaller local community groups who want to be actively part of these projects in their community as subcontractors, but cannot afford the same level of insurance requirements as we have for lead grantees. So we're working to reduce insurance requirements for our subcontractors and subgrantees. We would love to further CBO's direct support and funding. We haven't fleshed out the details yet about this item, and certainly need your valuable feedback and suggestions on how to do this. But our thinking is to develop some sort of a formalized structure for direct involvement of CBOs and grassroots organizations. It would be in programs outreach work, it could be in a planning, as well as technical assistance for potential applicants in a more local level. Our main goals are capacity building, empowering CBOs, and find better ways to fund priority communities directly versus funneling funds through the administrator entity. And the last one is to open eligibility for fixed route microtransit services like Shuttle or mini school bus that are operating on a predetermined route according to a fixed schedule, not solely dynamically based on customer demand. Next slide. So, okay, now in terms of timing and next steps, we are planning to open the technical assistance and outreach window in just a couple of weeks. The TA window will include a series of educational webinars about program requirements and application walkthrough to prepare potential applicants when window 2 is open. The updated implementation manual and application material will also be released based on proposed changes that we are covering today. CMO website is also under major improvements. Many great tools and guiding documents are being developed as well to help applicants plan for their projects and apply. We're anticipating to open window 2 sometimes in late fall this year. We'll have more certainty on how much funding we're going to have for window 2, hopefully by next Wednesday. June 15 is the date that the legislator must approve the state budget. So more about funding availability. Our potential amount based on the current May revised budget is $147 million for CMO. This includes some secured money from previous fiscal years, plus the California Energy Commission leverage funding, which this total is $21 million for voucher. So this is the minimum of funding that we're going to have for window 2. As mentioned before, ZEV accelerated package includes $110 million line item for CMO. Staff also proposing an additional $16 million of the $419 million budget that hopefully will get our board approval on this in November. Next slide. So assuming the ZEV accelerated package will be signed with the same line item and minimum dollar amount for CMO, we have some proposed funding set-asides to prioritize funding in order to accelerate them to communities as soon as possible. I would note that the priority list here is not in this specific order necessarily. The first bullet is $30 million in total for our window 1 mobility project voucher awardees. We have 20 mobility project grantees, which we could offer each $1.5 million as we are increasing the award to $2.5 million. As mentioned earlier, our current grantees are dealing with significant rise in capital and operation costs, especially insurance, and they have pressing needs for our support so they can launch services sooner for their communities. The second bullet is about $25 million for Window 1 needs assessment voucher recipients. This set aside was proposed during last year's work groups. We would really love to continue our support for our Window 1 needs assessment awardees that have done a tremendous work in a peak of the pandemic with all the challenges they face to do a meaningful community engagement and meeting with residents. They all found creative ways to make this happen and finish their assessment reports ambitiously so they can apply for mobility project voucher when next application window opens. We're hoping that this will give them some peace of mind that they can bring those assessments into life and implement the project that community residents identified as their transportation gaps. Third bullet is about CARB's regional mobility projects. We heard about them a lot today earlier. As I mentioned, our regional pilot projects have demonstrated to CARB that additional funding will be needed to support them for financial sustainability. So we are proposing at least $10 million to be dedicated to these projects to expand the current service or continue their existing funded project to support for implementing long-term sustainability. Next bullet is proposing about $23 million for eligible applicants that came in through the last application window, Window 1, before it was officially closed, but we couldn't fund them because the program was oversubscribed. This is, by the way, for both needs assessment and mobility project vouchers, but the amount may change when we're including needs assessments. Some mobility project voucher applications were rejected last time because we had a limitation in first round for our current car share project grantees and their soft grantees. So they will be included here as well. And last but not least is tribal governments, about $10 million for mobility projects for these applicants. Similar to Window 1, we would love to continue our support to make sure there will be at least 4 mobility projects guaranteed to be funded in tribal communities. If the additional fund coming in and we can move forward with these proposed set aside, there will be still about $25 million remaining for communities that have never been involved throughout this process. We know that there are many, many more communities in need for these type of funding. That's why we're planning to reach out to as many new disadvantaged and low-income communities as possible statewide, especially those that were determined through our gap analysis, and hoping that every community that is eligible for these funding will learn about our program and could get the help they need from our great technical assistant team to apply. So please make sure you are subscribed to our mailing list so you can stay up to date on funding opportunities and opening time of Window 2. I'm going to put that subscription link in the chat box right now so you can all have it. Thank you. And I think with that, we can now open it for discussion. I can pose 2 main questions. Are there any specific question on these proposed improvements or the timeline? And also, are there any questions on proposed funding set-asides? Please feel free to raise your hand or submit a comment or a question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ava. We have a couple raised hands. Let's go to Jill Sherman. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, sorry, I feel like I'm taking over the meeting. I hear that you are raising the needs assessment to $75,000, but I think you really need to rethink that because I don't know if you've, I mentioned to you before that the tool, the needs assessment tool that you somebody created is a really good tool, but I don't know if you're aware that it takes about 20 minutes to fill it out. What we experienced with the consumers that we did our needs assessment is that each survey took between 45 minutes to an hour and 15, depending on the questions, depending on if the individual was having difficulty reading reading the needs assessment and answering the questions. Most, in our case, we were actually, we verbally asked the questions and then used it. And so I think when you look at a organization that may be trying to gather 3,000 responses or doing their needs assessment, that they're going to need more time, because if you're doing 3,000, and let's just say you're spending an average of 45 minutes per survey, that's about 200 or 2,250 hours, which is longer than a year to do 3,000 assessments. And I know the program's 9 months. I don't remember if you said you opened it for 12 months, but I think it needs to be more commensurate with how many surveys you're planning on doing, because the survey itself is pretty lengthy. And I never, I time tested myself doing it, and the fastest I could get it down for myself was 18 minutes, but that was after several attempts. It's a very long, it's very good, but it is an intensive survey process. So it does need to be commensurate with the number of people you're planning on survey. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jill, so much for your comments. I think we'll be covering that more when Violet is talking about our planning grant program, but certainly we will consider these in our needs assessment. And if you have any feedback on how much we should be increasing our current needs assessment voucher with the same scope that we have right now, and how long it takes to do this, please let us know. Thanks, Jill, again.
Okay, we have another raised hand from Joy Massey. Joy, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Ava, I don't know if it's possible to go back to your previous slide. Thank you. I wanted to know if you could expand on what looks like the fourth bullet point around the unfunded, like applications that were unfunded in window one, and kind of, I think it's great that there's the potential to fund those applications, but can you talk more about why they potentially were unfunded and then the move to fund them now to help my just understanding of this?
Sure, thank you for your question. Yes, so they were projects that came in, but they were, we had this limitation in the first round that we didn't allow our current CARB grantees and their subcontractors to use CMO voucher fund to expand their project and use these funds for continuing their existing services. So they came in really fast, but they were rejected. We have lifted that limitation now. So we're thinking that we can allow them we can allow those applications to be reviewed again. And if we have additional funding, offer them what they need. They were applications that came in after we were oversubscribed. And as you know, we were oversubscribed very, very soon, like in about, I don't know, a day or two, or maybe less than a day, I don't remember now. Anyway, but so if we get more funding, we would like to offer those applications that they came in before we close the application window. If we're eligible, we would like to provide funding for them for this round. So they will not need to reapply, to be more clear. Did that answer your question, Joey?
Yes, great. And especially the last part about not needing to reapply. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, another raised hand from Zach Franklin. Zach, your line is unmuted.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Ava. This is great. First of all, I just want to thank you and the rest of the staff for all these proposed improvements. There's so much good stuff in here that we've heard from over the years from different folks in the community. So just kind of want to, shout out to the folks who are kind of iterating the program to incorporate that feedback. Two kind of smaller board questions. One, for folks who maybe want to provide feedback on some of these questions, but aren't able to make this call, is there like a time frame that they need to make sure to get maybe email or other input to you by, just so that we can pass that information on? And then the second question relates to the what I asked before about the MPV voucher proposed set aside. Am I correct that the 30 million number is to allow up to all the 20 voucher recipients from window one to expand their budgets to this new $2.5 million cap? Basically, I'm asking in part because it's just the question is it a competitive thing? If it seems like you're doing it that way, maybe there's the idea is to not have the voucher one window folks compete with each other for those resources. So I just wanted to make sure that that's a correct understanding of the plan, assuming that the budget comes in the way it's projected.
Thank you, Zach, for your comments. So about your first question, we don't have any certain window or timing for submitting comments, unless, Ashley, please correct me if I'm wrong. For the CMO, as we are moving really fast on this program, and we would like to open the TA and outreach window in a couple of weeks. So if you can get your comments, by next week or by, within 10 days, I would greatly appreciate that. And there are email addresses that I'm sure Ashley will share with you all, so you can submit your comments directly to myself or Sam or to the program administrator team. About your second question, so the idea of providing 1.5 million extra funding for our window one mobility project voucher awardees, that is not competitive process. They do not have to, like others, they don't have to compete with them through the window. So they will be reaching out to those awardees and evaluate their needs and the gaps in their funding, and their voucher agreements will be amended. So they do not need to reapply. I hope this answered your question, Zach.
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Okay, we have another raised hand from Creighton Randall. Creighton, your line is unmuted. Or 1 second. Okay, let me promote you to panelist. Okay, Creighton, can we see if that worked?
Yeah, I hope you guys can hear me all right. That work? Okay, thanks. So, hey, yeah, I think that, we've given past advice about increasing the cap on CMO. In some cases, maybe decreasing the amount of CMO too, depending on the sort of scale of the project. So I think, just to echo Zach's comments, that there's a lot that makes sense here. So thank you for giving the thought to this. Larger funding amount does start to bring into question, is there a need for some kind of merit-based approach, which I think, in the past we've suggested that would be a good idea, sort of finding a way to kind of move beyond the voucher concept, beyond a minimum project size to more of a competitive process. We think would be a good idea. I think thinking about this from a perspective of like, I'll just say CMO applicants maybe who were more accurate in budgeting the cost of their projects. I would hate to see those organizations penalized if perhaps they need an increase in the budget size of 25% versus 250%. So just, I think in short, we would be encouraging some sort of merit-based approach as you think about injecting additional funds into existing projects.
Thank you, Creighton.
Okay, we have another hand raised from Cindy DeRisco. Cindy, your line is unmuted.
Hello. So I wanted to go back to the needs assessment and the actual surveys. So I don't remember if I saw this in the operations or the manual for the CMO project, but there's a, gift incentive if you gave gift cards. So there's an incentive log that needs to be filled out. And so if you have somebody like 3,000 people who fill out the survey, like Jill was saying, maybe rethinking that log. Is it really necessary documentation that we need to provide? And then I know our tribe had issues with the privacy or, anonymity issues for providing their name, even on that log, and which gift card they got. So I don't know if that's in the works for being rethought. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. We've got 5 in the Q&A. I'll read through them really quickly. We've got about 35 minutes and 20 slides. What we'll probably do is consolidate some of the discussion periods afterwards. So Ollie Danner asks, are there studies that focus on EV subscription models in addition to sharing, hailing, and renting? I am not sure, but we'll do some internal talking and reach out to you afterwards. Moses Stites comment is, before any additional funding is considered to projects, CARBS needs to assess the cost effectiveness of each project. Otherwise, making these projects sustainable is unrealistic, and the projects are without direction and oversight on what is needed to be sustainable versus just providing a service regardless of costs. Make these projects meaningful in all areas. Accountability is important at all levels and will provide credibility to obtain other grants from additional funding sources in addition to CARB. Publish these results so thresholds can be established for other project applicants in the future. Great comments. We're working on doing continuing analysis of our older projects and our newer projects. And we provide cost effectiveness in every funding plan of what we expect to get. So that information will continue to be published. Carolyn Rodier had a comment, please consider increasing planning grants up to $200,000 to allow for high quality planning and consider a 2-year project period. Thank you. We'll have more on not just CMO, but planning in a little bit. Russell Teal asks, when will window 2 be released? We're hoping the technical assistance is opened up in the next few weeks, depending on feedback from this work group, and then funding applications later in the fall. And then Piet Cannon says, it seems there is a total of 25 million for window 1 CTNA recipients. I thought there were 24 recipients, so that would average about 1 million per CMO voucher project. How does this align with new 2.5 per cap CMO project vouchers? It doesn't align. What we try to do is think consciously about what projects, what communities haven't gotten funding yet. So we want to still continue providing funding for those. Also, we've heard from, I believe, 10 to 12 of the CTNA recipients that they would apply. So we're trying to cover as many of those as possible. If there are others that would like to reach out and let us know about it, please do. And one other thing, we know the 419 million is not enough to meet the state's needs. So we're hoping this is just another big step in showing the demand to the legislature and the governor's office, or the legislature, that more funding is needed for these areas. So again, I appreciate all your comments and questions. I think we can move on to the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Bree, and I'm going to talk about STEP and clean mobility in schools. I'm covering clean mobility in schools for the lead staff, Heather Choi, who couldn't be here today. So Clean Mobility in Schools is a competitive grant program focused on the clean transportation needs of public school districts. Grants provide funding for zero-emission vehicles, charging infrastructure, and active and alternative modes of transportation, zero-emission landscaping equipment, and they also support workforce development. CARB is proposing to allocate $125 million to this project to support a new solicitation for new project funds. CARB anticipates updating the solicitation through a public process in late 2022, followed by an early 2023 opening of the application window. Clean Mobility in Schools intends to align requirements with STEP, the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, to the extent feasible in the next solicitation. We're trying to use the same terminology and definitions in the solicitations, maintain the same requirements of applicants and grantees where it makes sense and still meets the goals of the programs, and align our timelines and processes, including potential technical assistance. California public school districts in low income and disadvantaged communities will be eligible, just as was done in the first solicitation for Clean Mobility in Schools. STEP is a competitive grant program that funds a larger suite of clean transportation, land use, and supporting projects to increase transportation equity. STEP-funded projects such as public transit subsidies, shuttle services, and active transportation infrastructure address community residents' transportation needs and increase access to key destinations while reducing the need for personal vehicle use in support of regional sustainable community strategies. CARB is proposing to allocate $125 million to STEP to support a new solicitation for implementation grants. CARB anticipates updating the solicitation through a public process and selecting a technical assistance provider in late 2022, followed by an early 2023 opening of the application window. And just as I noted on the last slide, STEP intends to align requirements with Clean Mobility in Schools to the extent feasible in their next solicitation. Local governments, community-based organizations, and tribal governments in disadvantaged and low-income communities will be eligible as lead applicants. 2 notes here. So we're proposing to expand eligibility to include low-income communities. Only disadvantaged communities were eligible for implementation grants in the first STEP solicitation. We're also proposing to expand tribal government eligibility to encompass all tribal governments, not just federally recognized tribal authorities, as was the case again in the first STEP solicitation. I just want to note to an earlier question that we saw come through in this work group meeting. We do have a lot of lessons learned from the first solicitation in the early days. We're now almost at a year actually of grant implementation. Some of those lessons learned can be found on our STEP webpage in an interim technical assistance report that's published and available there. We're also planning to review and update the solicitation based on feedback we've been receiving in the next about 6 months through a public process. So we'll dive into some more details on both STEP and Clean Mobility in Schools and kind of address some of the feedback that we've been hearing through that process. So here are some discussion questions. I'll read through them and then I think we'll move on to the planning and capacity building section and kind of address these all in one discussion segment after Violet's done talking about planning and capacity building. Some of the questions that we have for you all are: what barriers need to be overcome for new communities to apply for clean mobility options and the new Clean Mobility in Schools and STEP solicitations? We've already heard some information on that. In addition to technical assistance for school districts, what specific needs should CARB consider for the new Clean Mobility in Schools solicitation? What specific steps should CARB take to ensure these investments are actually community driven, which is their intent? And what steps should CARB take to ensure that these investments reach the communities that need them most? Let's take a second to digest that and then we'll move on to planning and capacity building.
Okay, so as mentioned, staff, we're proposing an allocation of $43 million for planning and capacity building grants to support the development of community-driven and centered projects, provide technical assistance, which we realize is pretty integral and vital to in the mobility space. This grant funding is intended to build on lessons we have learned on the need to be flexible and fund projects that address a broad range of community needs and barriers, including those we might now be able to cover through existing programs based on eligible cost and things like that. Elements that are critical to inform development of these grants include stakeholder feedback and overall lessons we've gathered through the pilot project development phase in mobility investments, but also key findings and recommendations coming from the Community Transportation Planning Evaluation the Othering and Belonging Institute is conducting. Staff's current thinking is that these grants be administered through a competitive solicitation process or through expanding some of our existing programs. No final determination has been made there, as we want to make sure we have this meeting today and continue to flesh out some of these ideas, the funding category in general, and also be able to talk about funding amounts and things like that. So this will be sort of finalized as the funding plan is finalized. So there are multiple planning capacity building grant funding opportunities we've identified. Things such as community transportation needs and equity assessments, community organizing, education, outreach, and meaningful engagement efforts, capacity building to implement new or enhance existing community transportation planning operations or infrastructure projects, job assistance and workforce development programs, things like that. So in addition to mobility project support, the intent is for the grants to include funding that specifically is dedicated to technical assistance for application support and implementation of planning and capacity building projects, as well as clean mobility in schools and STEP projects, given the needs already identified. One of the biggest things we want to get out of the discussion on planning capacity building grant funding opportunities is, what additional types of planning capacity building projects should we be funding? There were some comments on the amount that these should be extended to. So that's certainly something we're thinking about as well. Maybe not just $200,000, but more even. So we're open to other ideas and want to discuss now so we can finalize our proposal. So I think we're opening up to another comments and questions. So you can address the questions that were asked, that Bree asked about clean mobility in schools and STEP, but also if you have questions or ideas in terms of planning and capacity building projects. So please feel free to raise your hand or submit a comment or question. And I think this slide shows the various options.
I think we'll give folks a moment to digest, see if they have any questions. For now, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A or, oh, here we have a hand raised from Zach Franklin. Zach, your line is unmuted.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Well, this is fantastic. Really, really love that y'all are proposing this. This is going to be badly needed. To the prompt and the question about what types of projects, I like what you have out there where there's a pretty broad range of projects. I like the idea of keeping it broad in terms of allowing different communities to propose different types of projects that reflect their own needs, as opposed to kind of narrowing down the menu at the restaurant up front, and maybe instead focusing on some of the previous questions around, instead of narrowing it down based on types of projects, it could be more focusing on, the kind of community level prioritization that was discussed earlier. So a lot more flexibility in the types of projects, but to the extent that you're looking at criteria, maybe using this as an opportunity to do those more prioritized investments in, Black-led organizations, organizations that have a track record of working with a specific group, where they can then demonstrate that, what's being proposed is something that the community that they have a history of working with has asked for. So that could be one way of keeping it flexible in terms of the type, but still having kind of a focus and prioritization, based on racial equity.
Thanks for that. It also occurred to me that, maybe there's multiple things that communities want funded. And so I don't know that we would want to limit to one particular topic. So it's useful.
And I'll just add on one thought I had, and we had a meeting the other day with some other folks, just to highlight, like, this planning and capacity building grant proposal, I think will set a lot of communities up who aren't ready for mobility investments now to be in a great spot in 2 or 3 years. So as we're looking at accelerated funding for this year for communities that are ready, we're hoping that this puts us in place. And I know I'm repeating things that you've already heard, but I just wanted to echo and actually repeat that comment to make sure that we're looking at this long-term wise.
All right, anything else, John? Are we good to move on?
Good to move on.
Thanks. Okay, so this is our last major section of content. I'm going to cover some updates to the Clean Mobility Long-Term Plan proposal based on the May revised budget and our desire to support all of our clean mobility programs. CARB's proposed long-term strategy for clean mobility investments is multifold to address the complexity and importance of these projects in changing the transportation landscape. It's consistent with the goals of SB 1275. CARB has tried to estimate clean mobility funding demand for at least the next 3 years. However, while developing the methodology, our goal is to determine program funding needs over a longer period, for example, the next 5, 10, or 20 years, depending on how many communities we need to reach. We want to continue to invest in clean mobility options, clean mobility in schools, and STEP to transition from the pilot to program phase. And we want to expand the scope of what we have traditionally funded for planning and capacity building to include new and flexible project types. Through development of the long-term strategy, we're also considering how to better support sustainable community strategy implementation, as we realize that local VMT reductions are vital to meeting our transportation, climate, and equity goals. Direct ties between SCS, Sustainable Community Strategies, implementation, and some of CARB's incentive programs, including CMO, the Regional Clean Mobility Pilots, and STEP, are included as part of the solution in the draft SB 150 Tracking Progress Report released this week, which focuses on supporting transformation of the state's transportation system as a whole. Some other considerations in the long-term plan strategy include analyzing mobility investment gaps, and our goal is to ensure that overburdened communities have access to funding opportunities and are not left out of the process. We also plan to provide updates to stakeholders annually through the funding plan process, just as we're doing today. Our goal is to share progress on and outcomes of our analyses and evaluations, and updates made based on the feedback that we receive both through public processes and individual meetings. And lastly, we want to continue to fund our current mobility projects to support their sustainability in the long term and avoid stranded investments. We're considering a few possible methodologies for analyzing long-term funding demand for clean mobility investments. One of them is demand from previous solicitations, which were all oversubscribed, though we feel actually that this could underestimate potential demand since funding needs and community awareness have shifted over time. We're also trying to review the communities that have and have not received funding based on demographic and geographic analyses. We can do some of this through mapping, which Sean will discuss next. But while mapping helps us understand generally which communities we've reached, it doesn't necessarily help us understand who exactly is using and benefiting from the funded clean transportation services. And we're working on standardizing and collecting data across our programs. And we'll use this data to, in the future, to perform better analyses on that. And we're very open to thoughts on how to go about completing this type of analysis. We also need to consider approaches that don't ignore existing investments that may be left stranded, as we mentioned before, if we don't continue to support them, especially given the importance of longevity for increasing mobility access. And we're open to other ideas and approaches about how to identify and address long-term funding demand. I'll pass it over to Sean to talk about what we've done so far.
Thanks, Barry. Today, I'll be sharing the initial findings of our clean mobility investment gap research. And our intent for the gap research is to use a data-driven approach in tandem with stakeholder engagement and recommendations to find meaningful ways to both identify gaps and refine our methodologies. The findings I'm presenting today are based on the data-driven approach. And I'll just quickly note that for this particular analysis, we're using US Census Bureau data, Calendar Screen 4.0, and we're using census tracts to define service areas for our clean mobility programs. What we've heard through the long-term plan workgroup process, as well as other CARB meetings, is the need to better address and understand where there are gaps in clean mobility investments, including outreach and education. The analysis is to address concerns and equally measure socioeconomic and other benefits of our investments, and it's ongoing. We are fine-tuning our review and analysis, but can share that some of the results are that we need to increase participation in mobility investments in Black and Asian American communities. As mentioned, this would be in part done through dedicated and meaningful outreach to these communities, as well as mobility planning and building capacity at the ground level to be able to apply and reap the benefits of the mobility programs. Next slide. All right, so CARB is working to identify clean mobility investment gaps based on specific census tracts. What we have here is the Calendar Screen 4.0 and AB 1550 designated census tracts as one critical mechanism of understanding where more focus, outreach, and planning will be required. This is, of course, one way to look at gaps and where to focus investments, outreach, and education, but will certainly not be the only one. As we understand there are concerns with what communities could be left out and not properly identified in, say, low income or disadvantaged communities based on air quality or other possible factors. This table shows the total number of census tracts in California based on SB 535 and Assembly Bill 1550. It includes total census tracts for each designation, as well as census tracts that have received funding from CARB to implement clean mobility projects. The population column includes total population of census tracts that have access to clean mobility programs, or in other words, residents that reside in census tracts where the clean mobility program is based. The gap column is intended to show the percentage of communities that have not been reached through CARB clean mobility investments. You can see here that there are quite a few census tracts with clean mobility projects, but there are more needs to be done to fill funding gaps, especially based on broader community needs and a desire to benefit broader populations. All right, so this map was developed with our GIS software and helps to show gaps in clean mobility funding based on Calendar Screen 4.0. This map essentially piggybacks on the previous slide by displaying the table in a map form. So essentially what we have here is our clean mobility service areas layered with disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. This map highlights CARB's clean mobility investment projects located largely in the Central Valley, Bay Area, parts of Northern California, LA, San Diego, and inland regions in Eastern Sierras as well. And so for those of you who may be working on small monitors, the legend at the bottom of the left corner of the map, the clean mobility project areas are indicated by the gray color. And then clean mobility project areas that are in disadvantaged or low income communities are identified with black crosshatching. Calendar Screen 4.0 is indicated by the black color on the map, and low income communities are indicated by the yellow color on the map. And I just want to note that although geographic coverage may look like a lot, the number of zero emission vehicles and bikes out there are minimal. So we know there are a lot more people that could use the services. Okay, next slide, please. And so one additional component we've included today in this analysis is working to identify clean mobility investment gaps based on census tract demographics. We are building upon efforts that have already taken place to understand gaps in the program participation. For example, through our clean mobility options, the Shared Use Mobility Center conducted an analysis for the clean mobility options, similar to what we're seeing here. And they used it to evaluate window one lessons learned and found that there was less participation from Black communities and Asian American communities. More work needs to be done to discuss this effort with our current grantees and communities to determine the appropriate methodology for identifying demographics communities that clean mobility investments are currently servicing. The visual demonstrate CARB's early analysis, providing aggregate demographic race percentages across all of our clean mobility investments. So this is one example of how data collected on the census tract demographics could be displayed. But as I mentioned here, we want to hear your thoughts. All right. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I know I moved through that kind of quickly. So please let me know if you need us to refer back to any slides. To help us think through mobility projects and future investments, we have developed a couple discussion questions we'd like your feedback on. What methodologies should be used to determine funding gaps for projections of future funding needs? And what other ideas or suggestions questions do you have for identifying opportunities for future investments? Please take a few minutes to think about this, and then we can call on raised hands and check the question and answer box.
At this time, we'll also take any comments or questions on the long-term plan discussion we've been having.
All right, we have a raised hand from Brett. Brett, your line is unmuted.
Great, thank you. I had I guess one quick question about the data methodology and then a follow-up question based on that. But when you were showing the demographics and I'm assuming that that's coming from the census tracts. That's not, you know, data collected by users, for example, of the projects. But when you're thinking about demographics, or is that maybe part of the question that you're asking?
Right, that's coming from the data from the census tracts, and we don't have that specificity for all of our programs. So we're kind of using the census tracts as a way to kind of represent the populations that could be using the services in those areas.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. So for, I guess, my next follow-up comment suggestion with that is and also too, when we think about some of these shared mobility, especially the shared mobility projects and just mobility in general, I think it runs into an issue of, especially in areas where census tracts are smaller in area, you could have a project that's on the boundary of a census tract that might serve folks in, you know, folks living in another census tract. And so I guess with that, it complicates the issue, but it's not without solution. And I guess my prior experience with this would be when looking at, so not so positive connotation, but the negative connotation of like hazardous waste siting and just disproportionate siting, and looking at, you know, in that field, for example, a lot of sites get placed on boundaries of zip codes and census tracts. So when we wanted to see, you know, the demographics surrounding a place, you do the buffer zones around that, and then you do weighting amidst the different census tracts. So examining, you know, like if it's a shared mobility project, you know, a lot of these have, you know, ranges for the, you know, distance that, you know, they're serving for the project. And if it's near the boundary of a census tract, but serves, you know, a 5-mile radius, looking at the 5-mile radius and doing that weighting to see, you know, what does the population look like around that, not necessarily like specific to that census tract that houses the project itself. I just wanted to bring that up because I think for the mobility projects, it's important to note that these hopefully do get folks moving around and going to other places in their community. And, you know, census data is great, it serves a purpose, but unfortunately the census tracts are not like social boundaries, they're, you know, geopolitical boundaries, and so they don't always reflect the social and the neighborhood characteristic. And so yeah, I just wanted to voice that, but then also to the extent that we can supplement with yeah, funding surveys and things to get at participation, and direct participation, I think is always great because it supplements the census data with a bit more granular on the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you. Helpful comments and suggestions, and totally agree that we also need to get data on who's actually using the services. And the way we do that often is through surveys. And we are working on collecting better data on that so we can use that in the future.
Okay, no other questions on the attendee list. We'll go over to the Q&A for a comment from Russell Teal. LEAP plans to expand to other priority communities to create a statewide network.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here really quickly. This is Lauren McCarthy from the Shared Use Mobility Center, part of the CMO program. Love to hear more about your idea here, Russ, since as you know, we have the Clean Mobility Equity Alliance as part of CMO, which is a statewide network of projects. So I think, we have aligned visions here. We want to connect. So please feel free to reach out to the CMO team to talk more about this. But it's a wonderful thing to be thinking about. Thanks so much.
Anything else, Sean?
One more comment in the Q&A from Caroline Rodier. The evaluations need to assess who is using the service. Surveys need to have reasonable response rates, which typically require shorter surveys and financial incentives.
Thanks.
And I think
All right, so to close out, we're going to go through the most important next steps leading up to the November board meeting for the funding plan. So CARB is going to continue to hold various work group meetings and workshops on other projects in support of the fiscal year 22-23 funding plan through July of this year. This is the last work group meeting specific to clean mobility investments, but they will be covered in the funding plan workshop, which is anticipated to be held on July 21st. And prior to that, the draft funding plan is expected to be released in early July, so you can take a look at that in advance of the workshop. CARB also plans to hold clean mobility implementation work groups from July to September, so that we'll get into the weeds a little bit more, especially on STEP and clean mobility in school solicitations, and cover some policy changes and a lot more detail than we were able to get into in these long-term plan work groups. On October 7th, CARB anticipates releasing the final draft funding plan with the long-term plan appendix for public review and comment. The comment period for that will close on November 7th, and then for consideration at the November board meeting scheduled for November 17th and 18th. And as discussed earlier, in late fall 2022, we plan to open the CMO application window number 2, and then in early 2023, we hope to release the new CMIS and Clean Mobility in Schools and STEP solicitations. Please reach out to either myself, Bree Swenson, or my colleague Ashley Giorgio if there are questions on the long-term plan for clean mobility investments. We want to hear from you. We welcome feedback anytime, written or a request for individual meetings. And I know Ava also put her contact information in the chat for some of the specific feedback and questions we got on clean mobility options. As a reminder, we also encourage those who may not have had the chance to subscribe to our listserv that you can do so via the link at the bottom of this slide, and maybe someone can put that in the chat as well. If you subscribe there, you'll receive delivery notices with upcoming meeting information, and be sure to check clean and sustainable mobility options under the heading Clean Transportation Incentives for updates on the programs that you heard about today. That concludes today's work group meeting. Thank you so much for getting through these 3 hours and your great feedback. And please reach out to us directly if you have any follow-up questions, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.